There are mysteries born of chaos, of violence, of human greed. And then there are mysteries born of silence. A silence so profound, so absolute, it becomes a story in itself. A story of a world meticulously ordered, a system designed to conquer the darkness that was, in a single moment, swallowed by an inexplicable void. Our story takes us to the very edge of the map, to a place the Romans called the Ultima Thule, the end of the known world. The Flannan Isles, a lonely cluster of 7 uninhabited rocks piercing the surface of the North Atlantic, 20 miles west of the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. They are a place steeped in a primal, ancient dread. For centuries, these islands were a geography of fear. A place shepherds would only visit in summer to graze their sheep. A place where they would speak in hushed tones and perform strange rituals to appease ancient spirits. They believed in the Flannan Fresh, an unearthly luminescence that would sometimes surround the islands, a warning from another world. This was not just a place of isolation. It was a place where the veil between worlds was said to be thin. It was into this world of logic and legend that the first discordant note of our mystery was played. On the night of December 15th, the steamer Arctur, making its way from Philadelphia to Leith, passed the Isles. Her captain noted something unusual and deeply unsettling in his ship's log. In the heart of a rising storm, where there should have been a brilliant guiding flash, every 30 seconds, the great lamp of the Flannan Isles lighthouse was dark. It was a wound in the logic of the world. A lighthouse, whose sole purpose is to burn, was silent. The Flannan Isles light was a marvel of Victorian engineering, a testament to mankind's will to impose order on the savagery of nature. Designed by the famed Stevenson family, the same family that produced the writer, Robert Louis Stevenson, it was a 75-foot tower of brilliant white stone, a fortress built to withstand the worst the Atlantic could throw at it. Inside was a clockwork heart of polished brass and a lens of perfectly ground crystal, capable of casting a beam of light visible for over 20 miles. Its operation was a matter of meticulous, unwavering routine, and that routine was the responsibility of 3 men. Thomas Marshall, the principal keeper, a seasoned veteran of the Northern Lighthouse Board, with a reputation for being stoic and unflappable. James Duckett, the first assistant, a devoted family man with a wife and 4 children waiting for him on the mainland. And Donald MacArthur, the second assistant, an occasional keeper known for his immense physical strength and a fiery, sometimes volatile temper. 3 men, 3 lives, sealed together in a stone tower, their only company the wind, the sea, and each other. To be a keeper was to live a life of disciplined isolation, a life governed by the rhythmic turning of the lamp, the ticking of the clock, the meticulous keeping of the log. Every detail of their existence, from the polishing of the brass to the trimming of the wicks, was a sacred duty, because they knew that hundreds of lives, on ships they would never see, depended on that single, unwavering beam of light. They were soldiers in a quiet war against the darkness. But in the final days of their recorded existence, something began to go wrong. The disciplined entries of the logbook began to tell a story of encroaching dread. On December 12th, Thomas Marshall, the stoic principal keeper, made a terrifying entry. He wrote of a storm with winds, such as I have never seen before, and then an entry that would baffle investigators for a century. James Duckett, the quiet family man, had been very silent, and Donald MacArthur, the tough, seasoned sailor, had been crying. This is the first great enigma of the Flannan Isles. Meteorological records from the time confirmed that while the weather was inclement, the truly catastrophic storm that would later hit the area had not yet arrived. The terror recorded in that logbook seems to have preceded the actual storm. What then were they seeing? The next day, December 13th, Marshall's entry continued the narrative of fear. The storm was still raging. He wrote that the 3 men had been praying for a storm to end, that, by all accounts, was not yet at its peak. What terror could reduce three hardened, experienced keepers of the light to prayer in a fortress built to withstand the apocalypse? The final entry is dated December 15th, the day the SS Arctur saw the light was out. It reads, "Storm ended, sea calm. God is over all." A statement of profound relief. The last words ever recorded. After this entry, the official chronicle of life in the Flannan Isles lighthouse ceases. The men, their story, their very existence, dissolves into silence. It was 11 days later, on the 26th of December, that the relief ship Hesperus finally arrived, carrying a fresh keeper, Joseph Moore. The landing was perilous, the sea still churning from the storm that had truly hit in the intervening days. As Moore stepped onto the island, he was greeted not by his colleagues, but by an unnerving, profound silence. The provision box at the landing stage was untouched. The flagstaff was bare. No one came to meet him. With a knot of dread tightening in his stomach, Moore ascended the path to the great white tower. He called out. The only answer was the echo of his own voice against the stone. He found the main door to the lighthouse shut, but unlocked. Inside, the entryway was quiet. He noted 2 sets of foul-weather gear were missing. One, belonging to Donald MacArthur, was still hanging on its peg. Moore made his way to the small, circular kitchen. What he saw there was a scene of ordinary life, interrupted so suddenly it felt like a violation. A clock on the wall had stopped. An overturned chair lay on its side, and on the table, a plate of salted mutton, potatoes, and pickles sat cold and uneaten. Joseph Moore continued his search through every room of the silent, lonely tower. But the keepers were not there. They were not on the island. They were simply gone. Join us for part 2 of Voices of Innocent, an impossible absence. An absence is not nothing. It is a presence of its own. On the afternoon of December 26, 1900, on the lonely rock of Island Moore, that absence was deafening. Joseph Moore, the relief keeper, having found the lighthouse abandoned and the clock stopped, knew something was catastrophically wrong. He raced back down to the landing, his face a mask of disbelief and fear, to alert his captain. The ship's captain, Jim Harvey, an experienced mariner, ordered a full and immediate search. A party of sailors was sent ashore to assist. What they were looking for was not yet a mystery. They were searching for the logical, if tragic, explanation. An accident. Perhaps one of the men had fallen from the cliffs, and the other 2 had perished trying to save him. Perhaps they had been caught outside by the savage storm that had raged for days. But as the search progressed, every rational expectation began to disintegrate against a wall of chilling anomalies. Inside the lighthouse, everything was in a state of arrested routine. The lamp, its magnificent crystal lens clean and polished, had been trimmed and refueled, ready for the coming night. It had simply not been lit. In the keeper's sleeping quarters, the beds were unmade, the last vestiges of a normal morning. But the discovery that haunted Captain Harvey the most was the one Joseph Moore had already noted. Donald MacArthur's foul-weather oilskins were still hanging on their hook. To a landsman, this is a minor detail. To a seaman, to a man who lived his life governed by the fury of the Atlantic, it was an impossibility. The idea that a keeper would willingly venture out into a ferocious December storm on the Scottish coast without his essential protective gear was not just improbable. It was a virtual death sentence. It spoke of a situation so sudden, so cataclysmic, that the most basic survival instincts had been abandoned. The search moved outside the tower, to the west of the island, where the evidence of the storm's true power was written on the landscape itself. The men discovered significant damage to the landing area. A supply crate containing ropes, chains, and tools, which had been secured in a crevice 110 feet above sea level, had been broken open, its contents strewn about. The iron railings of the landing stage were bent and twisted out of shape. The final, damning piece of evidence was a single, enormous block of stone, weighing over a ton, that had been dislodged and moved. This was not the work of a normal storm. This was the work of a freak wave, a wall of water of unimaginable size and power. Captain Harvey, having seen enough, sent a desperate telegraph back to the mainland. It read, "A dreadful accident has happened at Flannan's. The 3 keepers have disappeared from the island. The clocks were stopped, and other signs indicated that the accident must have happened about a week ago." His language was precise. An accident. He, like any man of reason, was trying to impose a logical narrative on an illogical scene. The news sent a shockwave through the Northern Lighthouse Board. This was an unprecedented event. Their superintendent, Robert Muirhead, who had personally recruited all 3 of the vanished men, immediately sailed for the islands to conduct the board's official inquiry. Muirhead was a meticulous, rational man, and he would write the report that, to this day, remains the only official explanation for the fate of the Flannan Isles keepers. I am of the opinion that the most likely explanation of this disappearance is that the men had been on duty and went down to the landing place to see after the crane. He theorized that a series of massive waves, perhaps larger than any they had ever seen, had crashed over the cliffs, catching James Duckett and Thomas Marshall completely by surprise and sweeping them into the churning sea. Donald MacArthur, Muirhead surmised, was the 3rd man. Perhaps he had been in the tower when he saw his colleagues hit. It would explain the overturned chair, the act of a man jumping up in a state of terror. Forgetting his oilskins in a moment of sheer panic, MacArthur raced out into the storm to help, only to be swept away by another rogue wave. It was a tragic but plausible sequence of events. A perfect, devastating confluence of man, sea, and storm. And yet, even in Muirhead's tidy, logical explanation, the paradoxes remained. If all 3 men were washed away from the western landing, as the damage suggested, why was the East Landing's provision box found untouched? More disturbingly, if the men were so experienced, why were they on the landing during the peak of a storm in the first place? It violated every single rule of the Northern Lighthouse Board, a rule that existed for one reason: to prevent this exact type of accident. And there was the logbook, the account of a terror that seemed to predate the actual storm. Muirhead's report makes no mention of the men crying, or of praying days before the worst of the weather arrived. He seemed to disregard the psychological evidence of a creeping, internal dread in favor of the physical evidence of an external, cataclysmic force. The official file on the Flannan Isles mystery was closed. But for the public, and for the families of the lost, the real mystery, the mystery of why, was now wide open. The keepers had left behind more than just a mystery. They had left behind wives and children, lives now shattered, forever condemned to live with a story that had no ending. No bodies were ever recovered. There were no graves to visit, no final goodbyes to be said. Just a void, an unanswerable question that would echo through their family, a wound passed down from one generation to the next. Official logic had provided an answer, but it could not provide closure. The silence of the island began to speak a new language, the language of legend, of folklore, of the supernatural. The public imagination was about to take over where the official investigation had left off, proposing theories that were far more fantastic and far more terrifying. Join us for Part 3 of Voices of Innocent, the theories from the void. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does the human mind. When an official explanation fails to satisfy our need for meaning, when the pieces of a puzzle refuse to form a coherent picture, we begin to create pictures of our own. The official report on the Flannan Isles, a neat and tidy narrative of a freak wave, was a story about an accident. But it could not explain the dread in the logbook, the uneaten meal, or the abandoned oilskins. And in the vacuum of its failures, a universe of darker, stranger possibilities began to bloom. The first and most grounded of the alternative theories looked not to the sea, but inward, into the fragile psychology of the men themselves. It explored a simple, brutal possibility: madness and murder. To be a keeper was a job of immense fortitude, but the isolation was a formidable enemy. 3 men, sealed in a stone cylinder miles from civilization, with the constant, maddening roar of the Atlantic for a soundtrack. It was a perfect crucible for a psychological collapse. Suspicion quickly fell on the occasional keeper, Donald MacArthur. He was known ashore as a brawler, a man of intimidating strength and a short fuse. Did the close quarters, the relentless storm, and the grating of personalities finally cause him to snap? The theory unfolds like a classic work of suspense. A trivial argument escalates. MacArthur, in a fit of rage, strikes and kills Thomas Marshall. James Duckett, witnessing the act, tries to intervene and is also killed. MacArthur, now a double murderer, drags the bodies of his colleagues down to the western landing and casts them into the furious sea. Then, overcome by a tidal wave of guilt and madness, he leaps from the cliffs to his own death. This theory seems to explain some of the clues. The overturned chair could be the remnant of a violent struggle. It could even, in a stretch of the imagination, explain the uneaten meal, the tragic final supper of men who would never finish it. But the theory quickly crumbles under its own weight. The lighthouse was, by all accounts, pristine. There was no sign of a fight, no blood, no evidence of a struggle of any kind. And how does one reconcile this vision of violent chaos with the final, calm, and perfectly penned logbook entry? Storm ended, sea calm, God is over all. The theory of madness was compelling human drama, but it was not a convincing solution. With the internal explanation falling short, the public imagination turned to external forces. If the threat didn't come from inside the lighthouse, it must have come from the sea. Rumors of a ghost ship began to circulate, a rogue vessel, crewed by pirates or foreign agents, that made a clandestine stop at the island. In this narrative, the keepers stumbled upon some illicit activity and were abducted to be silenced. The idea was not entirely without precedent. The dawn of the 20th century was a time of naval rivalries and espionage. A lighthouse in such a strategic location could be seen as a military asset. Could the men have been taken by spies who wanted to extinguish the light for a nefarious purpose? This theory would account for the vanishing of all 3 men, but it is a theory completely devoid of evidence. No such ships were reported in the area. No nation ever hinted at such an operation. Like the theory of madness, it was another ghost story, haunting but insubstantial. And so, having exhausted the realm of the plausible, the public turned to the legends that had haunted the islands for centuries. If the killers were not men, perhaps they were monsters. Ballads and poems were written, speculating that a great sea serpent had risen from the depths, plucking the men one by one from the cliffs. Others spoke of a colossal seabird, a beast from mythology that had carried the keepers away into the sky. These tales seem fantastical to the modern mind, but they tap into the primal fear of the sea, the belief that the deep holds secrets and entities beyond human comprehension. They provided a mythic answer to a mythic problem, and spoke to the profound terror recorded in Marshall S. logbook far better than the theory of a simple wave, a rogue wave, a fight to the death, a ghost ship, a sea monster. Decades of speculation have produced a universe of theories, each attempting to explain the events of December 1900. Yet not a single one can account for every piece of the puzzle. Not one can satisfyingly explain the combination of the stopped clocks, the untouched meal, the uneaten supper, the words in the logbook, and the final, haunting detail of Donald MacArthur's oilskin coat, left behind as he vanished from the face of the earth. After the initial flurry of interest, the case of the Flannan Isles faded from the headlines, passing into the quiet realm of folklore. For nearly a century, it seemed the story was complete, a perfect unsolved circle, destined to be a campfire tale forever. But the story was not over. The descendants of the lost men never stopped searching. And with the arrival of new technologies and a new will to investigate, the coldest clues from the scene, the cryptic logbook entries, the geography of the island itself, were about to be re-examined. A new, startlingly plausible theory was about to emerge. Join us for the final part of Voices of Innocent, Echoes in the Wind. A legacy is not written in stone, but in the memories of those left behind. For the families of the Flannan Isles keepers, the official story of a tragic accident was a hollow comfort. It was a narrative that could never be proven, a conclusion that left a permanent void of uncertainty. Their fathers, their husbands, had not simply died. They had vanished from the earth, their final moments an eternal and agonizing question mark. And that question was their inheritance, passed down from the widows and orphans of 1900 to their children, and then to their grandchildren. The hope of ever finding them alive eventually faded with the passing of George and Jenny Sauter, but the desire for a real, satisfying answer for the truth did not. They became the keepers of the keeper's memory, safeguarding every article, every letter, every shred of a story that the world had largely left to folklore. It is in the modern era that the coldest clues of the case have been re-examined, leading to a new and startlingly plausible theory. A theory that dismisses the supernatural, rejects the murder-suicide plot, and refines the freak wave explanation into something more specific and psychologically terrifying. This new theory, championed by researchers and historians, is built not on what the keepers did, but on where they were. Below the damaged western landing, hidden from view from the lighthouse tower, lies a massive sea cave. During severe storms from the west, the Atlantic Ocean is funneled into this narrow inlet with unimaginable force. It doesn't just create waves. It creates a hydraulic explosion, a compressed column of water and air that erupts upward onto the cliffs above with the power of a cannon. This theory provides a new, chilling context for Marshall's logbook. The storm he described days before the actual meteorological storm hit may not have been a storm of wind and rain. It may have been a storm of the sea itself. Exceptionally high tides, combined with a persistent swell from the west, could have been activating this sea cave for days, sending periodic, monstrous explosions of water up onto the landing, a terrifying, localized phenomenon that would have been invisible on any weather chart. This is the revised sequence of events. On the afternoon of December 15th, two of the keepers, likely Marshall and Duckett, venture down to the western landing to secure their equipment in anticipation of the coming storm. Suddenly, without warning, the sea cave erupts. A colossal plume of water explodes upward, dragging one of the men, perhaps, Duckett, into the sea. Marshall races to his aid, only for a second explosion to pull him in as well. Back in the lighthouse, Donald MacArthur, waiting for his colleagues to return, hears the unnatural roar from the cave. It explains the overturned chair. He jumps to his feet in a sudden panic. He races outside, forgetting his heavy oilskins, because he knows he only has seconds to act, not minutes, sprinting to the edge of the cliff to see what has happened. As he peers over the edge, desperately searching for his friends in the churning sea below, a third, final explosion erupts from the cave, and he too is gone. This theory of a localized, hydraulic cataclysm is the only one that seems to account for almost all the facts. It explains the extensive damage to a specific area high above the sea. It provides a plausible reason for experienced men to be caught unawares. It accounts for the abandoned oilskins as the act of a man in a desperate, split-second race to save his colleagues. And it aligns with the profound terror described in the logbook. Yet even here, questions linger. The quiet meal on the table remains a paradox, a ghost at the feast that will likely never be fully explained. In the end, the Flannan Isles mystery endures, because it lives at the perfect intersection of the known and the unknowable. We can use science to explain the power of the waves, psychology to explain the panic, but we can never truly know the final thoughts of the three men who were erased from the world. The light on the Flannan Isles was relit, and new keepers were stationed there for decades to come, until the lighthouse was finally automated in 1971. The tower still stands, a silent stone monument to an impossible event. What happened to Thomas Marshall, James Duckett, and Donald MacArthur is a story where the silence has become the only answer. They are a reminder of the raw and terrifying power of nature, and of the profound fragility of human life at the lonely edges of our world. Forgetting is the final injustice. We choose to remember. Share your opinion in the comments below. Join our community and subscribe to Voices of Innocent. See you soon with another true storytelling journey.